Thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak here at CAS2014. It's great to be back in Barcelona, and thank you for the organizers for making me feel at home, because when I arrived yesterday, the weather was exactly the same as when I left Norway. And they also, well, the location of this conference is also very close to my favorite vinyl record shops in Barcelona. So what more can I ask for? Yes, I work in finance, I have worked in HR, but I also have a short IT career. In the late 80s, I was project manager for when Statoil should implement a new finance system. And I was still on the finance side, but I was the project manager. And we were fighting IT for half a year on how to run this project. Because the system we were implementing was a great Swedish system. You could play around with it, model, experiment. And that's what we wanted to do. And we had a word for what we didn't want to do. We told IT we don't want to do waterfall. We didn't have a word for what we wanted to do instead. But actually, looking back, because we won that fight, we were able to run this project as we wanted it. And looking back, I think that was an attempt to run a project in an agile way. But it was quite an experience, and I actually said, never again an IT project. And I've kept that promise. What I would like to share with you today is first a little bit around problems with traditional management, because I would argue that there are some serious systemic problems with traditional management. That's where we need to start. Then I've got a few slides on this stuff called beyond budgeting. And as you heard, beyond budgeting is actually a somewhat misleading name, because the purpose is not necessarily to get rid of budgets. The purpose is to create organizations which are more human and more agile, because that is good and necessary for great performance. In order to do that, we need to change traditional management, and at the core of traditional management, we find the budgeting process and the budgeting mindset. So that is where the name is coming from. But it is about so much more than budgets, and yes, I would agree, this is about agile at enterprise level. Then we shall spend most of the time talking about how we are trying to do this at Statoil. And I'm saying trying because even if everything I will talk about is decided, it's written into what we call the Statoil book. We started out in 2005 on this journey, but that does not mean that all of this has reached every head and every corner of Statoil to 100%. A lot of managers find this actually quite difficult, because this is very different from what they maybe were educated in, have practiced for many years. So we need to respect that this is a long, hard change journey. It's not a quick fix. Should take time. But again, everything is decided, but we are still on the journey. And I'm not sure if we ever will be finished. This is a journey where the direction is in a way clearer than the end destination, to the extent there is an end destination. We discover more as we move on. We get braver as we move on. So it's a great journey. Statoil is a Norwegian oil and gas company with significant international activities. Here are some data on the company. We are also into renewables, offshore wind, and on Transparency International, you might know that organization. They consistently rank Statoil as one of the most transparent listed companies globally across businesses. On sustainability rankings, social responsibility rankings, we continue to rank in the very top across businesses. But it is a challenging, these are challenging times, because we absolutely acknowledge the climate issue and climate change, and we know we are part of the problem. We think we can be part of the solution as well. And that has to do with gas, because we are a big gas producer. If gas can replace all the coal consumed in Europe, that would have a huge impact on CO2 emissions. All right, let's talk about some problems, some budget problems. Often a weak link between strategy and budgets. It's a very time-consuming process. Some think this is the biggest problem. I would actually say it's the smallest problem, but it does belong on the list. Budgets often force decisions to be made too early and too high up in the organization. And that is a problem for many reasons. And by the way, decisions are not always improved simply because they are lifted upstairs. Assumptions quickly outdated. Budgets can prevent us from doing things we should do because it's not in the budget. And the other way around. It can lead us to do things we shouldn't do because it is in the budget. And you know, it's spend it or lose it. Budgets can lead to these strange forecasting horizons where finance people, when they do budgets, they are interested in understanding 12 months ahead. When they're into the first quarter, 9 months is enough because they can still see till year end. In the middle of the year, 6 months is okay because they can still see to the end of the year. In the autumn, 3 months is enough before they suddenly get interested in 12 months because then it's budget time and they need to look at next year. So they have a forecasting horizon that goes like this, just like an accordion horizon. I find that a bit funny. And last but not least, budgets can often be a very bad yardstick for evaluating performance. Not just because it's a very narrow mechanical performance language, but it also has to do with assumptions being quickly outdated. Now, I have shared this list of problems with tens of thousands of managers across the world over the last 10, 15 years. And most managers agree, yes, these are problems. But still, the big majority still continue to do this stuff. And I find that a bit strange. I think there can only be two reasons behind that. One reason can be that, yes, we know it's a flawed process, but what's the alternative? Well, beyond budgeting is actually an alternative. But it could also mean that, yes, we know it's a flawed process, but these are more kind of irritating itches. This is not a serious disease. I would disagree. These are symptoms of a very, very big problem. Because the purpose of this process is to support good performance in organizations. But I would argue that the opposite is the case. This is a process that has become an obstacle, a barrier for great performance. And if that is true, we have a serious, serious problem. So it's all about performance, getting the best possible performance in our organizations, defined in the right way. And I would like to reflect a little bit around performance in a slightly different setting than business before we move back to business. I would like us to move into traffic. Because in traffic, we would also like to experience good performance when we are driving to work in the morning or back home. I guess we all would like to, if we drive, to experience a safe and good flow of performance. So that's a safe and good flow of traffic. So that is a definition of performance in traffic. And traffic authorities, they are doing performance management to make that happen. And here is one thing we often meet, whether it's crossing traffic, the traffic light. Two questions. Who is actually managing here? Who is in control? And based on which information? And the one managing here is the guy that programmed this light. And the information that programming is based on would not be entirely fresh information, as you are sitting there waiting for that green light. And the guy who made these decisions would definitely not be in the situation together with you. There is an alternative to the traffic light, the roundabout. Same questions, very different answers. Who is managing here? It's us as drivers. And based on which information? Fresh, real-time, here and now information. So very different answers. Could be interesting to compare a bit more these two ways of managing. So let's do that. First of all, which of these two is normally most efficient? It's the roundabout. It's been proven that the roundabout is more efficient. And maybe that has to do with what we just talked about, access to fresh information. Well, of course, you have access to fresh information in front of that light as well. But what you don't have is the authority to act on that information, because that rests with somebody else. I would argue that there is one more thing that needs to be in place for the roundabout to be more efficient. I'll come back to that in a minute. Which of these two is most difficult to drive in? It's the roundabout. And I would argue that everything we are trying to leave behind at Statoil is in many ways easier than what we are trying to do instead, especially from a leadership point of view. But our guiding star cannot be to go for what's easy, because it's easy. We have to go for the stuff that's good, and sometimes good for performance, and sometimes that is a bit more difficult. Leadership is actually not meant to be easy. Last but not least, before we leave traffic, is it relevant to talk about values? in this setting of traffic? And I would argue yes. We sometimes talk about values-based management, and the opposite of values-based management is rules-based management. And the traffic light is one simple big rule. Red is stop and green is drive. We can always discuss yellow, but it is a very simple rules-based system. And if there is a value set, a mindset among drivers waiting for that green light, which is about me first, I don't care about the rest, that is not a big problem in front of that light. But in the roundabout, that mindset of me first, I don't care about the rest, is actually a big problem. Because in the roundabout, we are much more dependent on having a common, positive purpose, a wish of wanting this to flow well. Here we have to interact more with people. We have to interpret each other's intentions. We have to be more considerate. So it's not enough with fresh information authority to act. We also need a positive value set. Highly relevant when we now in a minute shall move back to business. What we see on the right-hand side is not an issue of, I would argue, of traffic authorities managing traffic. That's what they do on the left-hand side. But on the right-hand side, in the roundabout, it is more about creating conditions for great performance to take place. And after that, it's actually a bit hands-off. And I think that is how we need to think about these big topics, especially if we work in finance and HR and design these performance management processes. We should think more about creating conditions for great performance to take place, and then a bit hands-off. You might have heard the expression by Peter Drucker. He once said that 90% of what we call management is about making it difficult for people to do their job. And I would agree. All right. By the way, I'm going to get out of this straitjacket. That is actually what Beyond Budgeting is about, creating room to move. What we see on the right-hand side here is a more self-regulating way of managing. And I would argue that in today's business realities, we need more self-regulating management models. And we need it for two reasons. The first reason has to do with the world out there, which is a very different and more dynamic, turbulent, unpredictable place than when I started my budgeting and planning career at Statoil back in the early 80s. And by the way, my first management job in Statoil in 1984, that was as head of the corporate budget department. I've been heading up more budget processes in that job and other finance manager jobs that I want to be reminded about. I mean, looking back, I've done a lot of stupid things in my life, but at least on the professional side. But I think it gives me a platform for being quite critical. And again, at that time, it was a more stable, plannable world. There was not that much out there of what they in the military called VUCA. You might have heard that expression, VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. If we take that VUCA seriously, it has significant implications on how we design our management models compared to if we think there is no VUCA out there. The other reality we need to take seriously is not external, it's internal. It has to do with people. And it has to do with asking ourselves, what kind of people do we think we generally have in our organizations? And there are many labels and languages you can use for that discussion. We chose to go back to good old Douglas McGregor, who in 1960 introduced something he called Theory X and Theory Y. It has nothing to do with Generation X and Y, that came much later. Theory, and these are basically two opposing views on people and what motivates people. Theory X is very much the negative view on people, a view that most people in an organization is a bunch of potential thieves and crooks, which all must be managed tightly and kept on short leashes, because if not, we know what will happen. They will all run away and do a lot of stupid things and spend money like drunken sailors. Well, that's the popular version. McGregor, he was a bit more academic and polite in his book, but I think that's what he meant. Then you have Theory Y, very much the opposite, a view that most people, beyond being well-educated, competent, are actually responsible, mature people who want to do a good job, want to perform, want to be involved, want to be listened to, want to be treated as adults. And again, without necessarily having a view on what is right or wrong, I do have, but whether you mainly believe in X or mainly believe in Y, it should have significant implications on how you design your management models. If we combine these two realities that we need to reflect on and take seriously, the world out there, people in the organization, then it might look like this, and you recognize the two dimensions. And I would argue that traditional management lies in that lower left-hand corner, with a conscious or unconscious view that the world is still a plannable place, and then most people falls on the X side. A few more words on X and Y before I move on here, because this is not a question of being naive. Every time I talk about X and Y, there are some faces popping up in my head. And I can see those guys right now. And those faces, they belong to colleagues of mine at Statoil, which I think I would put on the left-hand side. I think you need to keep a close eye on those guys. There might be some faces popping up in your heads now as well, because I mean, these guys, you typically find them in most organizations. That's not the issue. The issue is, do they constitute a majority or a minority? Because if they exist, but they constitute a minority, then we cannot base the design of our management models on minorities. Then we need to start with our majority view. And if that is theory Y, then that must drive the design of our management models. I mean, this is just like in a free society. We are not putting everybody in jail because somebody someday did or someday will do something wrong. We are all free citizens within certain boundaries. Now, in order to get out of this lower left-hand corner, we need to address both leadership and management processes. And what we need to get out of is something that's very rigid, it's very detailed, it's very annual, rules-based, a lot of micromanagement, centralized command and control, there's a lot of secrecy, and a strong belief in sticks and carrots as ways to drive performance. I recall when I made this slide some years ago, I thought that, Bjarte, now you're a bit too hard on traditional management. But I've been sharing this slide with, again, tens of thousands of managers across the world. I've seen so many nodding faces when I put up this slide that I don't think I was too hard. And by the way, there might have been a time where this was the right place to be, right thing to do. There might even be places around where this is the right thing to do. But for us in Statoil, that is a completely uninteresting discussion, because we know that our business environment is up here and not down here. There is a lot of VUCA. Just look at what happened with the oil price right now. Do you think we had expected that? And we believe that most people lies on the Y side and not on the X side, which means that we can't be in that corner. We need to move up in the upper right-hand corner by addressing both dimensions. On the leadership side, we need to be more values-based than rules-based. This does not mean no rules. Of course, we need operating procedures at our platforms offshore, but it simply means that the more values-based you are, the less rules you typically need. We need more autonomy. In this VUCA world, there isn't always time to run 9 floors up to get that decision. Then it might be too late. And again, decisions aren't always improved because they are lifted upstairs. We need more transparency, and this is good news for all the concerned managers I've met who are afraid of leaving that comfortable lower left-hand corner because they are afraid of losing control. And I can, in a way, understand the fear, because I can see the fear in their eyes. The fear is real, although a lot of these controls they are afraid of losing are only illusions of control. But the fear is still real. But here is some good news for scared managers. Transparency can be a very effective control mechanism, a social control mechanism. There is a reason why thieves and crooks operate at night, because then it's dark. Here is a wonderful story from a Swiss pharmaceutical company called Roche. You might have heard about them. They are quite big and quite traditionally managed. But recently, they did a very interesting experiment in an area that we all can relate to, namely travel cost. In a pilot, they kicked out the travel budgets, most of the travel rules and regulations. What they implemented instead was full transparency. So with a few exceptions, everybody could see everything. If you traveled, to where, did you fly, eat, and sleep, cheap or expensive? And then they started out. And what do you think happened with travel cost in the pilot versus travel cost in the rest of the company? Came down through a very simple self-regulating control mechanism, transparency. Last but not least, we need to get hold of that internal, the intrinsic motivation in people that can move mountains if we can reach it. Unfortunately, what is generally practiced in organizations is about external, extrinsic motivation, like, for instance, individual bonuses, in the belief that if you put that on top of the intrinsic motivation, you get more motivation. Well, research is actually saying the opposite. that at the best, it has no effect at all to put the extrinsic on top of the intrinsic. At the worst, that extrinsic, external motivation can actually destroy the internal motivation. At Statoil, we have always tried to be a people-oriented, values-based company since we hit the ground running in the early 70s. I'm not saying we are perfect, but our challenge was maybe that we had management processes that had a different message. Because it doesn't help to have these theory-why leadership visions. It doesn't help to write nice things about people and values in a book if your management processes express theory X. That creates gaps between what we say and do, and those gaps are poison. So we need to close those gaps, and there are many things you need to do here. Not just to close those gaps, but also to make your management model more robust against all the VUCA. And here are some examples. Typically, we need to kick out the traditional budget and the budgeting process, because that is, if you read the lower left-hand corner, that is very much about what traditional budgeting is about. But more specifically, we need to think differently around how we set targets and goals. We need less of what I often call 29.2 targets. Right? The target is 29.2. Anything above is good, anything below is bad, end of story. That is a very narrow, mechanical performance language in this kind of world with these kind of people on board. So first, we need to think more relative. How are we doing versus others? It doesn't help to hit 29.2 if our competitors are doing 30 or 35 and vice versa. There also has to be room for values. How did we achieve those results? It's not just an issue of what we deliver, it's also a question of how we deliver. And there has to be room for hindsight insights when we evaluate performance. All the things we know afterwards that we don't know up front. We call this a holistic performance evaluation. I'll come back to that in a minute. We also need to do something with the rhythm of our processes. Why should everything circulate around January to December? January to December and the calendar year is very often an artificial construct from a business point of view. Not from an accounting point of view, but that's not what we are talking about here. We are talking about business. And we need to organize our processes more on business-driven, event-driven rhythms instead of forcing everything into this straitjacket of January to December. And this is actually what Beyond Budgeting is about, trying to move up in this upper right-hand corner by addressing both leadership and management processes in a consistent way. Some managers, some finance people, they find the horizontal discussion challenging. Values, people, leadership, they are more comfortable working on changing management processes. And of course, you can get some way and make some progress by changing your processes, but if you want the full potential out of this, you also need to address the leadership side of this. Statoil is in no way alone on this journey, trying to move up in that upper right-hand corner. Here is an example of some other companies on this journey. And on the left-hand side, some Norwegian companies that you wouldn't know. In the middle, some other Scandinavian European companies. On the right-hand side, some US companies, and in between a few South American, Asian companies. Let me give you one example here. Miles on the left-hand side. That is a Norwegian IT company. Of course, no budgets, but also no targets. No KPI targets at all. Well, they do admit they have one target. They want to earn more money than the other guys. And yes, they do. Cost control at Miles. Their employees, it's an IT company, so the PC is important. They can buy whatever PC they want, as expensive as they want. Training is important. They can attend whatever training they want, whatever they want. The only thing the company requires is that when they've spent the money, it's posted on the intranet, so everybody can see. So that's the cost control mechanism, transparency. The most important process is recruitment. They put an enormous effort into recruiting the right people. They say, if we get that right, the rest follows. Wonderful company. They are doing great. Moving to a very different business in a very different place. You might have heard about Morningstar here up on the right-hand side. Tomato processing in the US. So it's not Silicon Valley high-tech. Morningstar has a completely flat structure. No managers. Their management model or their model, should I say, is built up around two simple principles. Nobody has the force to, or nobody can force anyone to do anything, and you shall keep your promises. So they don't have any performance contracts between yourself and somebody up there, because there is nobody up there. What they have is what they call letter of commitments, agreements between you and those are your colleagues that you have a relationship to, that you depend on in order to do your job, and vice versa. And those promises you should keep. And what about nobody can force anyone to do anything? What if this company wants to fire people? I don't think they do that very often, but they have a mechanism for it. I mean, if we are colleagues, and I think you should be fired, then the first step is that I should talk to you and tell you. You wouldn't agree. Next step is we would need to call in a mediator, a third person. If that doesn't work, they have a few escalation mechanisms. And the last kind of mechanism is the kind of committee on company level. But I think it's very seldom they have needed that mechanism. It's either ended up with some kind of agreements, either that you continue or that you realize that maybe I should leave. Maybe this is not the place for me. Wonderful company, and again, doing great. They've been running like this for a long, long time. Then they were discovered and ended up on the front page of Harvard Business Review. The headline, the most innovatively managed company in the world. They became very busy because everybody wanted to know what Morningstar is doing. Great case. But the veteran here is this bank on top. It's a Swedish bank called Handelsbanken. They today operate across Europe, quite big in the UK. It's the fastest growing bank in the UK right now. This bank completely abolished budgets already back in 1970. Not as a goal in itself, it was just one of many things they did in order to move up in that upper right-hand corner. And this bank has been sticking to this very different way of managing for more than 40 years now, which means that we should be able to ask, does this work? Is it good for performance? Because over 40 years, there should be some patterns. And there are. This bank has been performing better than the average of its competitors every single year since 1972. Every single year. This bank is among the most cost-effective universal banks in Europe without budgets. And this bank has never needed a bailout from the authorities because they messed it up. I can think of a number of other prestigious banks that at one point in time and maybe several times needed help because they messed it up. This bank, never. It can't be a coincidence. This is a very different management model and fantastic results year after year. There's been done a study on banks, a Norwegian business school. They looked at 100 banks. 9 of these operated without budgets, the rest with budgets, and they looked at profitability. And guess what? Very clear results. Banks without budgets were more profitable. Handelsbanken and some other companies, they inspired what became known as beyond budgeting in the late 90s and inspired the formulation of 12 beyond budgeting principles. And you might find some similarities here with the Agile manifesto and those principles. And I'll share with you those principles on the next slide before we move to the Statoil case. Just 2 reflections on those principles. First of all, some people, especially finance people, I don't think it goes for you guys, but especially finance people, they find this a bit too big and scary, especially the leadership side. But you don't have to do everything at the same time. Right? It is possible to do this a bit more stepwise, but it is important that every step you take kind of point in the right direction. The other message I have is that beyond budgeting is not a management recipe. Tick the boxes, do this, do that. There's a lot of management recipes out there, many of them coming from the US. I don't like management recipes because in a management recipe, somebody has told you exactly what to do. It's just about implementing other people's thinking. I find that quite boring and quite dangerous. So it's not identical what has happened in these companies. What has happened depends on what kind of business they're in, what kind of culture they have, what kind of history they have. But they have been inspired directly or indirectly by beyond budgeting because these are more principles, a philosophy, some guiding things. It's not mechanics. And I think you need to be careful in the Agile community because some of the stuff can easily be made into recipes. For instance, Scrum. If you think Scrum too mechanically, it can become a recipe. I think that is dangerous. Now, these are the principles. I will not go through all of these because we have talked about some of these already, but just a few reflections here. We need to address both leadership and management processes, as I said, in a consistent way, and we need to create the coherence between the two sides here, between what we say, what we do. And let me give you a few examples of the opposite that you very often find in organizations, a lack of coherence between the left-hand side and the right-hand side. Because it doesn't help that we, on the left-hand side, say or write warm and nice words about we and us and together and team. If everything we do on the process side, Principle 8, is about individual bonuses, and there's one message on the left-hand side, there's another message on the right-hand side, and guess which one is strongest? Equally, it doesn't help that we talk just as loud and warm about how fantastic people we have on board, and we will do nothing without you, and we trust you so much, but not that much. Of course, you must be managed through detailed travel budgets. If not, we know what will happen. Right? Our words become hollow if our management processes have a different message. There are a few misunderstandings around beyond budgeting, and one of them is that this is just about another way of managing cost. Well, it is about another way of managing cost, but it is just one of 12 principles. Principle 11 talks about cost, but it is about so much more, as I hope you can see. When it comes to cost, there's also a misunderstanding. Some people think that, well, no budget, that must mean for most people the budget is a cost budget. That must mean that I can spend whatever I want. Cost is not important. Wrong, very wrong. It's actually the other way around. Cost is important together with a lot of other things, but because cost is important, we need more intelligent ways of managing cost than what the traditional annual detailed budget can offer. Because then we sit in that process, we sit in the autumn every year at corporate level and hand out what easily amounts to millions of bags of money to the organization, right? Defining per cost center, per cost account, per activity, exactly how much to spend next year, down to the last penny. How do we know what is the optimal size of these millions of bags in the autumn the year before, if we at the same time acknowledge that there is a lot of VUCA out there, right? So, I mean, this doesn't go together. We need more effective, intelligent ways of managing cost. And I don't have time to go through all of that menu, but I mean, one mechanism that we have for projects is to say that, or one principle we have is to say that the bank is open 12 months a year, and not just once a year in the autumn. So you can always forward a project for approval. Whether it's a yes or no depends on two things. How good is that project against our decision criteria and strategy? And do we have the capacity as things looks today? And things as things looks today might be different from what things looked 2 months ago, 1 month ago. So it's a moving, very organic process. The bank is open 12 months a year. For other costs, operating costs, admin costs, and so on, we have a number of mechanisms. It could be a burn rate guiding, operate with it, I mean, at an activity level expressed in money as this kind of lump sum, roughly 1,000, until something else is decided. Within that, you have the freedom to do the right things. There are not a million details. It could be a unit cost target. You can spend more if you produce more, and vice versa. It could be a benchmark unit cost target. Your unit cost should be better, below average of your competitors, and so on and so on. There might be nothing at all. No budget, no cost target, nothing at all. The corporate staff that I'm based in, we've practiced that for many years. It's no problem. We monitor actual cost, talk about cost every day, try to make sensible decisions. If we shall make a big decision, we have a talk with our CFO. It might be a yes, might be a no, depending on the quality of what we propose and our capacity right now. Let me move to ambition to action, which is the process where we kind of run all of this. 3 principles or 3 purposes: translate strategy to create a common direction, create flexibility, agility, and last but not least, to activate words in this book around values, people, and leadership. ambition to action is a hybrid between the so-called balanced scorecard and beyond budgeting. And the reason for that is that Statoil implemented balanced scorecards already in the late 90s as an earlier adopter. So we had that when we kicked out the budget in 2005. But I have to say that I have a very ambivalent view around balanced scorecards, because if you are familiar with that concept, very often it is used in organizations to reinforce traditional management. If you like centralized command and control, micromanagement, it's a wonderful tool to have up in the corporate control center, compared to if you only can micromanage through a financial budget. And unfortunately, that is how it is used in many organizations. We are trying to do this in a different and better way, which I want to share with you. There are some steps in this process. It starts out with strategic objectives on the left-hand side, which is about translating the overall strategy into something more concrete. So what does success look like is a key question here. Here we are more on words than on numbers, and we are talking about a medium-term time horizon. Then we are trying to find KPIs that can measure that we are moving in this direction. The only problem with measurement is that measurement alone moves nothing. Nothing happens just because we measure. You don't lose weight simply by weighing yourself, which I have tried, and it didn't work very well. And then my wife, she told me that, Bjarte, maybe you didn't stand there long enough on that weight. And of course, that would have been one action to take, but that's not. We know we need to take actions, but it's not those kind of actions we want. We want actions that really moves us towards those objectives and try to understand consequences of these actions through forecasts. And then there is a translation of all of this into what does this mean for you and me and the teams that we are in. So here we are straight into the HR process. We started out with strategy, went through kind of call it finance territory and into HR. And we have worked very closely, the three of us together, to make this hang together in a good way. And on the right-hand side, that is an example of activating words in this book, because here we talk about delivery and behavior. And the very first words in the Statoil book are the following. At Statoil, the way we deliver as is important as what we deliver. And by the way we deliver, we talk about the values in this book. That decision came from our CEO 10 years ago. And in order to make everybody understand that he was serious about this, he put the weighting between the what and the how in all consequences for your career, base pay adjustments, individual bonus, and so on. He put that weighting to 50-50. And some might say that that was a brave decision, 50-50, because not that many companies are doing that. There are some, but not that many. On the other hand, it was an obvious decision, because how can we say that we are trying to be a values-based company if everything around values are completely absent in our management process? That would have been a big, big gap between what we say and what we do. Now, as I said, there was an inspiration from the balanced scorecard here. One challenge with that is that all our competitors, they also use balanced scorecards in some form or shape. So if we want to get competitive advantage out of this, we need to do it in a different and better way. And let me share with you some examples of that. The big difference is combining the balanced scorecard and beyond budgeting, but let me be more specific. Let me talk a bit about KPIs. If we look at many of our competitors, their scorecards consist only of KPIs. So there's nothing or very little on the left-hand side, on the right-hand side, and that is a problem because of the I in KPI, which stands for Key Performance Indicator, right? These are indicators. They are trying to indicate that we are moving towards those objectives. But they are not called KPTs. They are not called Key Performance Truth, because they are not necessarily always telling the full truth. They are not always revealing everything. So the KPIs actually need help in this job we often give them, on being a place where you express a target and then we shall measure that we are moving towards these targets. There has to be something more. There has to be something on the left-hand side, on the right-hand side, to create a richer, broader performance language. And we need this holistic performance evaluation, where we take off the measurement glasses before we conclude. I'll come back to that in a minute. You might have heard these wise words from Albert Einstein. Not everything that counts can be counted. And not everything that can be counted counts. So measurement can be a good servant, but as a master, it can be a disaster. And we have, unfortunately, seen some examples of that over the years. Don't misunderstand me. I mean, measurement, it is an important part of the model, but there has to be room for something more than measurement. Here is an example of an ambition to action. It's a screenshot from the system where we keep these. Forget the content because you probably can't read it, but you will recognize the three different the three first steps from the previous slide, and then the HR process is coming on the right-hand side. And we operate with these 5 perspectives that we have picked from the balanced scorecard. And that's basically about saying that, yes, we have some financial value creation targets. And by the way, if you can read it, those two are both relative. It is to financial KPIs, but it's not absolute numbers. This is about how should we perform versus competition on these 2 financial metrics. For instance, return on capital. There's not a fixed number, but we have a league table of 12 other oil and gas companies that we compete with, and the target is to do well against those. It could be above average, could be first quartile. These are very much evergreen targets. We've had the same targets for many, many years. We don't need a big process every year to reset those. And by the way, those 2, the outcome of those 2, how we are doing versus competition, that drives the common bonus scheme we have at Statoil. Everybody on board in the same boat, us against the competition. We do also have some individual bonuses. I'll come back to how we handle those. Today we have around 1,400 of these in the organization, and let me use this slide to reflect on 2 other areas where we try to be distinctively different. The first has to do with how do we create alignment here. The first purpose was to translate strategy, to create a common direction. There is a very easy way of doing that. It's called cascading. That's about sitting at corporate level, sitting up here, and then cascade and instruct all the way down. These are your objectives, your KPIs, your KPI targets and actions. And you know, finance people, they love cascading because when it comes to the numbers, you can create a perfect alignment. So when you add together all the numbers out there, it adds up to the corporate numbers. And when finance people can draw 2 lines under that answer, they think that, yes, perfect. We have perfect alignment, we're going to make it. But that's not the case, because if we, through that cascading, have killed everything around motivation, involvement, commitment, if you're sitting out there in the front line and your ambition to action only is a landing ground for instruction from above, we lose all those great things that we need in order to make sure that we deliver the involvement, the commitment, the motivation. So what we are doing is different things in order to not lose that, but at the same time create sufficient alignment. One thing we've done is to say that it's not mandatory to have an ambition to action. Teams decide for themselves. Some teams ask us, well, should we have one? Our advice would be, we think this is pretty good, but your main motivation for having an ambition to action should be that this is something that helps you and yourself and your team to manage yourself. That should be your main motivation. At the same time, this can't be an anarchy. There has to be some kind of alignment. This has to point in the same direction. But the mechanism we use to achieve that, we call that translation instead of cascading. And this is more than playing with words. Cascading is this level instructing this level. Translation is this level translating what is up here, or maybe further up, or maybe a bit left and right. If you're sitting out here, you would look upstairs, you would look left and right, depending on who you work with. And then you and your team should have a good, thorough discussion about what does our ambition to action need to look like in order to support the ambition level and direction of those teams that we have a relationship to. If such a translation should go wrong, which is not a problem, but if it should happen, of course the team above should intervene and do what they are paid for, but it's not a problem. One reason is transparency, because all of these ambition to actions are open, accessible for all employees. There is some share-sensitive, stock-sensitive information we have to close, but beyond that, everything open for everybody. So there's nowhere to hide with a stupid ambition to action that has an ambition level down here and direction here when it should point in that direction. Another reason for having transparency is the translation itself. I mean, how can we translate if everything around us is secret? That wouldn't work. This doesn't mean that we never instruct from above. There are situations where that is the right thing to do, but it should be more the exception than the rule. And if that is the case, it is also more accepted when it happens. But the main rule should be translation, not cascading. Another area where we try to be different has to do with time. We used to have annual versions of Ambition to Action, meaning that all these teams, they made a new one every autumn for next year and so on. Not anymore. Now, all these teams can change whatever they want on their Ambition to Action whenever they want. So you can change objectives if strategy change. You can change KPIs if those objectives change, or if you simply find a better KPI. You can even change these KPI targets if these targets have lost their meaning. And that could either mean that, well, this target is impossible to achieve. Everybody laughs about it. We're never going to make it. Those targets, they don't work. They don't motivate. They don't inspire. They have only one purpose left, and that is punishment, which is not that inspiring. Or it could be the other way around. This target has, for some reason, become a piece of cake. The only control mechanism we have put around this is to say that if you want to change something that's big, if you're sitting out here, you want to change something that's big, you still need to seek approval one level up, but you can propose that at any time. If you want to change something that's small, you simply inform to the same level. Big or small, always make sure that you inform others affected by your changes. This is the coordination part of it. And then we have left it to the organization itself to define what is big and small. We can't sit at corporate level and define that for all these teams. Which means that somebody on the right-hand side here, they might end up with a different definition of big and small compared to somebody on the left-hand side. But as long as it works both places, this is okay. So back to the notion of the roundabout and self-regulation. We would like this process to be as self-regulating as possible. The less we need to do from corporate, the better it is. That doesn't mean that we should abdicate. We monitor if there are strange developments. We check it out. Sometimes we might have to intervene, but the less we have to intervene, the better it is. When it comes to time horizons, why should, for instance, all targets have a deadline end of December, which is often the case? Is that just because of the link to pay? And if so, is that a good enough reason? I don't think so. So targets should have natural time horizons. Some short, some long, depending on urgency, complexity, or what we are trying to solve. That doesn't mean that you can't sit down once a year and talk about performance. We do that still. We still have an annual rhythm on that, even if we have discussions about could we do it differently. But it simply means that when we sit down, some would look back on an Ambition to Action, where a lot of things have happened. Others, it's been more stable. Some targets were maybe delivered 3 months ago. Some is still work in progress. Some maybe was delivered just around year end. We haven't banned end of December targets. We shouldn't become fundamentalists, but maybe that should be more the exception than the rule. I've talked a few times about this holistic performance evaluation, so let me close off around that one. And holistic here means two things. First of all, the 50-50, not only looking at delivery and the what, but also on behavior and the how. But holistic also means, when it comes to the what and business delivery, which is defined by Ambition to Action, that we should not just read the color of those KPIs, red, green, or yellow, and then conclude. Because if performance evaluation for a manager is simply about counting the number of reds and number of greens, and then conclude, then the only qualification you need as a manager to do that job is that you can first count, and second, that you are not color blind. And I think we should have somewhat higher requirements towards our managers than those two. So, yes, we do measure, we do look at these colors, but then we take off the measurement glasses and look at things that measurement is not picking up. Yes, I see that the KPI is green, but have we really moved towards those strategic objectives? How ambitious were those targets? Imagine a situation where there was one team really stretching maybe inspired by somebody out there, setting a target here that didn't completely make it. Then you have one team better on the low ball in gaming, target here, performance here. They made it. But if you take away those targets, who performed best? It was these guys, not these guys. So should we punish people simply because who stretched and didn't completely make it? I don't think so. So this is a very important question, the second one, to create comfort around stretching. Because without that question, I would argue that if you're a rational manager, the most stupid thing you can do is to stretch. Even if finance and HR and everybody says you should kind of set stretch targets, it's the most stupid thing you can do. It only reduces the chances of getting the goodies of hitting that number, right? So we have to create comfort around stretching, fairness. Another question, has there been significant changes in assumptions? Was there a competitor going bankrupt, so hitting that target was a piece of cake? Or was there an earthquake in Japan that makes things a bit more difficult? All the things we know afterwards that we didn't know up front. We should not take everything into account, but big major headwind, tailwind, we should take into account. Now, some people would say that this way of evaluating performance is too subjective. And we do have some of those managers at Statoil who say that wouldn't it be easier if the target was 29.2, end of story. And no, that would be completely objective and no subjectivity involved. Well, I think those guys are fooling themselves. Because think about, if we limit ourselves to 29.2 and that's it, think about the time when we are setting that target. If it's an annual target, set the autumn the year before. At that time, we are trying to describe what good performance is looking like 15 months down the road, right? We're trying to, the autumn year before, and decide what does good performance look like 50 months down the road at the end of next year. And we do that under a lot of uncertainty, right? We have to make a lot of assumptions. So we are applying a lot of subjectivity at the point in time when we are trying to conclude on should it be 29.2 or 30 or 28. But then of course, we need to conclude. We end up with 29.2, and then suddenly we have forgotten that we have been very subjective. Right? So why should we not allow ourselves to be subjective also afterwards when we are forced to be it up front? Because afterwards it is so much easier to be subjective, because then a lot of the uncertainty has become certainty. A lot of the assumptions have kicked in or not kicked in. So we can never be entirely objective. And that is why it makes sense to be subjective afterwards and have this holistic performance evaluation. Now, I hope you have seen that the things I've been talking about, and I haven't talked about all of this, but that what we are doing is trying to move the whole sentiment of how we think around these important issues towards the self-regulating metaphor of the roundabout and moving away from the performance management-driven, rules-driven traffic light. When it comes to cost, when it comes to rhythm, translation, thinking more relative, and also on transparency. This is an attempt to make things more simple. But again, from a process point of view, but from a leadership point of view, as I said, this is not necessarily easier. But leadership, again, is not meant to be easy. So this is what I wanted to share with you. I don't know if there is time for questions, but if anyone wants to contact me later on, feel free to do that on these coordinates. If anyone wants to follow me on Twitter, that's highly appreciated. I only tweet about Beyond Budgeting, by the way. And if someone is even more interested, there is something called the Beyond Budgeting Roundtable, which is a network of companies interested in this. In these things. In Europe, we meet typically twice a year in London. And if anyone is interested to come along as a guest to kind of check out what this is, you're more than welcome. Just send us a mail or go to bbrt.org. And if you want to have more information about Beyond Budgeting, go to the same webpage, and with one click, you have subscribed to our monthly newsletter. And if you're even more interested, what you just heard was actually the short version of the startup story, the very short version. There is a long version, as you heard at the introduction. I wrote this book not just about what we've done at Statoil, but also what we did in a company called Borealis, where we kicked out the budget in 1995. And that was actually where my beyond budgeting journey started 20 years ago. And when it started 20 years ago, I thought that within a couple of years, this would be the new way of companies being managed, because this was so brilliantly obvious, I thought. It has taken somewhat longer time, but now we register an enormous interest from this, from a number of smaller companies, but also increasingly a number of big companies out there. So something is happening. And I think one reason is that communities like us are starting to discover each other and join forces, because I think Agile needs beyond budgeting, because you guys can be as agile as you want on your level, but at one level you hit a big system. If that is constructed around other principles, then you have a problem. And I think we need you guys, because there's a lot we can learn in beyond budgeting from Agile. So the more we can join forces, the stronger we are. Thank you very much.